Hi, and welcome back to the Contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles. If you enjoy Westerns, I hope you'll hit the subscribe and notification icons. I truly appreciate your support. If you're enjoying the story and you're interested in a copy of my novel, Hunting Charm, you can check my Amazon page or contact me directly through my Patreon page. I'll have links to both in the description below. Any support is deeply appreciated. In today's episode, you'll hear Chapter 11 of my novel, Hunting Charm. If you haven't listened to the previous chapters, I heartily recommend you do so. I have the first 10 chapters in a playlist, also linked below. In today's chapter, I return to a character introduced in Chapter 1. As the boy, Henry Cactus Branch Walker, witnessed his father's death and suffered injuries at the hands of slave catchers. It was an event that scarred Henry both physically and emotionally for life. In Chapter 11, Henry sees Doreen Tarwater for the first time when she arrives at Cecil Johnson's mule ranch in Creek Territory, Indian Territory. Henry's first glimpse of Doreen might have been meaningless, but it is rendered prophetic because of Henry's troubled past. In today's plate of history beans, I'll look at the practice of slave catching. Starting in the 16th century, slave owners, not only in the U.S., but in Central and South America, where arguably slavery was even more prevalent than it was in the U.S., police-like agencies whose sole purpose was to recover escaped slaves were common. Slave catching was, as you can imagine, a brutal business, one that isn't widely spoken of nowadays. Slave owners had a lot of money tied up in slaves. As terrible as it sounds, slave catchers, or slave patrols as they were formerly called, provided a service. Slave catching as an institution, in my opinion, speaks volumes about the ways that man's desire for financial well-being can sometimes lead to dehumanization and suffering for others. Some might argue that it's best that we forget about practices like slave catching. After all, why open old wounds? Again, just my opinion, but I think by illuminating the past, we can, on rare occasions, avoid the same errors going forward. I personally don't know of anyone nowadays that approves of enslaving their fellow man. Maybe I'm lucky in that respect, but the general agreement that making another man your chattel is wrong seems like evidence that history curves toward justice. It gives me hope for the future. Nevertheless, slave trafficking still happens, and with it, the practice of slave catching is practiced as well, though nowadays, those agents must work in the shadows as criminals. The slave catchers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries didn't have to hide. They were not regarded as criminals, but rather as upstanding citizens doing an essential job. So I think a little plate of history beans about the practice of slave catching isn't entirely out of order. In Chapter 11 of Hunting Charm, we hear the story of how Henry Walker and his father attempted escape from the plantation they were enslaved upon and met with a band of slave catchers in northern Maryland. We also get a glimpse into the psychological aftermath of that encounter with slave catchers and how it changed Henry Cactus Branch Walker forever. So, without further ado, here's Chapter 11 of Hunting Charm, A Raptor's Claw. Hunting Charm, Chapter 11, A Raptor's Claw. She appeared the same way each time, framed against a vermilion sky. In his dreams, The angel smiled and held his deformed right hand in hers, as if the horrible claw, something even he could not look at without disgust, meant nothing to her. In his dream, in her presence, he felt whole again, as if a normal life might be possible. At age 11, Henry Walker fled from Rosewood, a plantation in northern Georgia. His father, Henry Sr., forced him to come along despite the objections of his mother, despite his own tearful refusals. Carrying only a few supplies, they left on a moonless night in late October and traveled north for a part of Pennsylvania that some still call Dutch country. They would never reach their destination. Just south of the Mason-Dixon line, a band of slave catchers caught up and gave chase through the dogwood, elm, and maple of northern Maryland. The hunters, a group of 9 men accompanied by a pack of over 20 dogs, had years of experience tracking slaves. The lawless band of self-proclaimed champions of law and order didn't hesitate when they saw Henry's group. They began whistling and firing their guns at the sky. The dogs, accustomed to their task, began barking and braying. In response, the slaves scattered and formed smaller groups of 2 or 3, losing to panic any advantage they might have had in unity. Henry and his father dodged into a thicket of oak brush, an action that stalled the men on horseback but didn't stop the dogs. When Henry and his father cleared the brush, a trio of bloodhounds closed quickly. Henry's father, a powerful man with muscles hardened by years of labor, snatched the first hound and, swinging it by a hind leg, broke the unfortunate canine against a tree. The remaining bloodhounds stopped and stood barking and whining alongside their shattered cousin. Henry and his son ran on. All around they heard the cries of their fellow slaves, the shouting of the slave hunters, and the bleat of a bugler blowing an out-of-tune call to arms. Henry's father pressed deeper into the brush, dragging his son until the sounds faded to distant echoes. At one point, Henry fell and told his father he couldn't continue. So Henry Sr. lifted his son and carried him. They pushed deep into the forest, then waded into a trickling river, hoping the water would mask their trail. Henry's father, with Henry on his shoulders, pushed through the knee-high current for the next 2 hours until they heard nothing but the chittering birds, the rustling wind through the red oaks. When they stopped, they had not stepped foot on dry land for 5 miles. Henry Walker Sr. must have felt they were safe. Cactus Branch had only vague memories of what happened next. The hour had grown late, well after midnight. They slept in a clearing surrounded by shagbark hickory and tulip poplar. When they awoke, it was to the sound of dogs crashing through the undergrowth. Henry recalled how a single mounted slave catcher appeared and with a sweeping motion tossed a net over his father. For a moment, it seemed the slaver had overplayed his hand as Henry's father planted his feet and unseated the rider. The white men let out a call as Henry's father pummeled him. Then a pistol appeared in the slaver's hand. A single shot resounded through the woods, and his father fell, struck in the right hip just below the belt line. A moment later, 2 more riders appeared, and their flight ended. Despite the bullet wound, his father survived and for 3 days willed himself to walk. On the 4th day he fell and couldn't stand. The slave riders left him to die on the roadside. Henry Sr. told his son goodbye, but Henry, determined not to leave his father's side, tussled with one of the slave catchers. In the fray, the white man wrenched Henry's arm and separated his right shoulder. As he lay writhing in pain, the slave catcher, angered by Henry's insolence, stomped his right forearm, shattering both the ulna and radius. Rather than treat the injury, the rider tied Henry's hands behind his back, an action that removed any chance the subluxated shoulder might move naturally back into its socket. Then the man stuffed Henry into a wooden box in the supply wagon and left him there for the remaining 4 days of their journey back to Rosewood. Perhaps mercifully, inside the box, the agony of Henry's shoulder and the concurrent shock rendered him unconscious most of the time. The vascular and nerve damage caused by the broken forearm and separated shoulder were irreversible. In the end, of the 18 slaves that left Rosewood 2 weeks earlier, only 10 survived. When Rosewood's owner saw Henry, he told the slave catchers to dispose of the boy. He was too damaged to do any work. So as the slave catchers left the plantation, they threw Henry into a ditch filled with tall cane a half-mile or so up the road. Only the resiliency of youth and sheer luck saved him. The roadside gully contained a small bit of rainwater, otherwise Henry might have died of dehydration. He might have died anyway, but after 2 days, an old woman everyone called Amma came along. She was on her way to town to purchase a few items for the Rosewood kitchen. At first, she judged Henry to be dead, as other passers-by had done, but Amma decided to take a closer look, thinking she might identify the deceased child. Making her way carefully, she stepped down into the cane and peered at Henry, who lay face down in the mud. When she placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, he moaned. "Oh, you poor child," she said. Despite her age, the sturdy woman hoisted Henry out of the ditch and carried him the half-mile back to Rosewood. After placing the boy into her own bed, Amma alerted one of the other women and began the walk back into town. She hurried, knowing her owner would be angry if she failed to serve dinner at the usual time. When Amma arrived back home late that evening, Jana, her granddaughter, had removed Henry's badly soiled clothing. She had cleaned him up some and had fed him a bit of oatmeal. Henry lay in Amma's bed for nearly a month, sleeping there beside her at night, slowly regaining strength. His damaged shoulder would never heal properly, and over time, the muscles in his broken right forearm atrophied, as did his right hand into a sort of raptor's claw. As he became more active, Amma realized she could no longer keep him hidden and informed her owner that Henry lived. Despite his injuries, Henry's strength returned. He soon proved useful, working at several tasks using only his left arm. He regained strength in his right arm as well, and though the range of motion was limited, he found ways to compensate. For the next 6 years, Henry worked year-round picking cotton, chopping firewood, hoeing weeds, and baling hay. Despite his physical recovery, it became clear that Henry's ordeal had changed him. He rarely spoke, and if he met one's gaze, which he almost never did, his eyes had the fearful look of a trapped animal. At the same time, he grew tall like his father. Even though some of the other slaves encouraged him to be more forthcoming, he remained silent and enigmatic. Gradually, rumors began to circulate that a dark spirit possessed the young man. Some even suggested he wielded a evil juju. So friendless and increasingly shunned by his fellow slaves, Henry's thoughts turned inward. It was during those years that the dreams started, always the same, the blonde woman floating above him, the blue skies beyond, the angel holding his damaged hand. When he turned 18, the owner of Rosewood, aware that the other slaves feared Henry, sold him to a passing trader for $10, an old wood-burning stove, and a half cord of oak firewood. 2 weeks later, his new owner traded Henry for a saddled pony and a stout draft mule to Jake McQueen. In today's Plate of History Beans, I'm going to take a look at slave catchers, or as they would have been called in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, slave patrollers or Paddy Rollers. Slave patrollers appeared early on in the history of American slavery. They were also prevalent in places like Brazil and Cuba, where wealthy European landowners controlled vast plantations, raising sugarcane, rice, and a host of other crops. Paddy rollers were hired by landowners to not only find escaped slaves, but to patrol the roads and countryside in the places where these plantations were located. While Paddy rollers were often thought of by many as drunken men of low character, there was also an element of civic duty attached to slave patrols. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy landowners to band together to recover escaped slaves. In truth, the bands of lawless drunks that were tasked with patrolling the South and South America and Central America and Cuba were hired by the wealthy landowners and were often led by those same wealthy men in certain circumstances. Slave owners had a good deal of money tied up in their slaves, and they generally viewed their chattel not as men, but rather as property. For 3 centuries, slaves weren't allowed to leave their place of enslavement without a pass, or some documentation proving they had a reason to be out on the road. If they were asked by their owner to leave for some reason, a trip to fetch supplies or work on a neighboring farm, for example, slave patrols would commonly stop any black person they happened to see on the road. If the slave couldn't present documentation, they were usually beaten before being returned to their owner. Paddy rollers were not shy about the use of physical and psychological terrorism. Armed with pistols and muskets, with bloodhounds and mastiff-like bulldogs to further track or intimidate any slaves they happened to come upon, Paddy rollers represent one of the most shameful elements in American history. There are myriad accounts of atrocities committed by Paddy rollers. Slaves were tarred and feathered, quartered, attached to 4 horses and pulled to pieces, whipped, torn apart by dogs, beaten, chained, lynched if they put up any resistance. Many slaves did resist, figuring it was better to die at the hands of Paddy rollers than return to the oppressive lives they were living on plantation, and their lives were terrible. Slaves were often asked to spend entire days standing in water to grow rice in broiling heat and high humidity. Rice farming, by the way, was by far the most deadly of all the crops grown by slaves. Slaves in coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and elsewhere were forced to remove cypress trees from alligator and swamp-infested areas then create berms, and drain fields. Then during the cycle of a rice crop's growth, fields were reflooded. Untold numbers of slaves died in rice fields. Indeed, slave owners even considered the economic question of losses outweighing gains when it came to deaths of their slaves, especially in rice fields. Compared to the other crops, cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, rice was the most terrible of all. But back to paddy rollers. Not every instance of paddy roller cruelty ended bitterly for slaves. There were rare instances where slaves outsmarted the slave patrols. In one particularly interesting account from an elderly former slave woman named Minnie Fulks, she talks about how paddy rollers consistently attacked a group of slaves for holding Christian worship services. On one occasion, the slaves, looking to get even, secretly placed grapevines across the road so when the paddy rollers left, after terrorizing the congregation, their horses would get tangled in the vines. On that one occasion, one of the paddy rollers, whose horse stumbled because of the vines, became entangled himself and was strangled by the vines when his horse bolted. Such instances of slaves getting the better of slave catchers, however, were practically non-existent. To add insult to the cruelty of paddy rollers, there was an element of romanticism attached to paddy rollers at times. There were songs written making heroes out of these men. Take a look at the photo here. I won't repeat the title of this particular song, but the tune appears in the movie 12 Years a Slave. I'll have a link to the song's lyrics in the comments below. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, which is based upon the memoirs of Solomon Northup, you're probably aware that Northup was conned by a pair of paddy rollers in Washington, D.C. and enslaved for 12 years. Northup's experience wasn't unusual. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of African Americans were granted freedom, mostly in the North, only to find themselves enslaved once more when groups of special paddy rollers kidnapped or conned them and sent them south to work on farms in what was then remote areas of the Deep South. I understand that some of the information on paddy rollers is disturbing. It isn't my intention to shame anyone today. As I've already said, I know that virtually everyone nowadays sees slavery for the terrible thing it is. Unfortunately, there are a few unscrupulous, criminal-minded individuals in modern times that continue to enslave men and women, often for the most lurid of pursuits, like sex or the drug trade. People who traffic other humans are now almost universally seen as criminals, which is as it should be. I would love to see a time when we can forget about paddy rollers, but we aren't there yet. I sincerely hope you accept my modest look at the distressing subject of slavery and paddy rollers, not as a personal indictment against Southern cultural heritage, but rather as a chance to move mankind forward in our understanding of one another. We can grow in kindness together if we can put aside our differences. We aren't so different. Thanks for listening to today's chapter from Hunting Charm and my plate of history beans about paddy rollers, or as they call them in Hunting Charm, the more modern usage, slave catchers. If you like today's episode, I hope you'll take a moment to hit the like and subscribe buttons. I would be truly grateful. That's it. for this week's Contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles.